They used to call me the Queen of Silicon Valley, Olivia Trask, crypto trader turned tech visionary, the kind of woman who walked into meetings with Tesla executives in jeans and got calls from the Wall Street Journal on a first-name basis. I had it all: funding rounds that tripled in hours, a sleek office in San Francisco with glass walls, and unlimited LaCroix interviews where I said things like, "We're redefining how humans experience digital trust." And people believed me. I believed me. But then the stories started, the scary ones. Not the usual Reddit threads about weird CEOs or startup horror stories. No, these were front-page real. Privacy violations, manipulated data, anonymized accounts that weren't really anonymous. Words like exploitation breach and whistleblower. And my name, Olivia Trask, was right there in bold. I still remember that morning. I was in my loft in Palo Alto, brushing my teeth when the phone buzzed, then buzzed again. Then it didn't stop buzzing. Slack, Telegram, Signal, even iMessages from people I hadn't spoken to in years. When I opened Twitter, my face was everywhere, not in admiration, in disgust. There's a kind of silence that happens when the noise is so loud, your brain shuts it off. I couldn't even hear myself breathing. I sat down on the bathroom floor in my towel, toothpaste still on my lip, staring at the screen as comments poured in like acid rain. "She's done. Another tech sociopath. Rot in crypto. Hell." And then the board called. They wanted me gone immediately. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just said, okay. I packed 3 bags, wired my assistant a final bonus, deleted every social app from my phone, and got in my car. I drove north until the sky turned gray, and my Tesla ran out of signal somewhere near the Oregon border. That's how I ended up here, in this cabin, in the woods alone. No Wi-Fi, no people, no excuses. Just the crackling of firewood and the occasional sound of pine cones hitting the roof like distant gunfire. The air smelled like moss and burnt bark. The windows had that kind of fog that won't wipe away no matter how many times you try. And inside it was just me. And silence. Not the kind that feels cozy or earned. Not the silence of peace. This silence was sharp, raw. It didn't whisper. It screamed. That first night I couldn't sleep. I lay on the mattress, still fully clothed, staring at the rafters. Every sound outside felt like a threat. I kept thinking maybe someone would come for me, investigators, journalists, angry users, but no one came. No one even knew where I'd gone. I kept replaying it in my mind. The articles, the screenshots, the betrayal of people I'd hired, mentored, raised capital beside. And underneath it all, the question I didn't want to ask, what if they were right? What if all of this was my fault? On the 3rd day, I threw my phone into the river behind the cabin. It wasn't bravery. It was panic. I'd just tried to check, Slack forgetting I'd deleted it. My finger hovered over nothing. That was when the nausea hit. I doubled over, dry heaving on the frozen soil. Dizzy and trembling. A panic attack. My first. I'd built platforms for 10 million users, brokered crypto deals over sushi in Beverly Hills, and stood on stages at SXSW talking about the future of identity. But here I was, face in the mud, crying without sound, not for the company, not for the money, but for the fact that I didn't know who I was, without the noise, without the calendar alerts and endless Slack messages and team all hands and product sprints and VC calls and user growth dashboards. Without all that, what was left? Just me and the forest, and a silence that wouldn't let me hide. That night I sat in front of the firearms wrapped around my knees. I stared into the flames like they had answers. They didn't. But I remember something shifting in that moment. Not clarity, not peace. Just a pause. A moment where I wasn't running. I didn't know it yet. But that was the beginning, not of healing. Not yet. That would come later. No, this was the beginning of being broken on purpose, of unraveling every false version of myself I had ever sold to the world and bought for myself. Because the truth was, I hadn't just built a product that manipulated people, I'd built a life that manipulated me, and now the only thing left was to listen to what that unbearable silence had to say. There's a stage of silence where your mind doesn't whisper it, claws. It doesn't invite introspection, it forces it. Like being locked in a room with every version of yourself you've ever tried to forget. I wasn't ready for that. The first week in the cabin was a blur. No emails, no pings, no meetings, just cold air, cheap canned soup, and my own breath fogging up the windows. At first, I tried to keep a routine. Wake up, boil, water, journal. Meditate, though I didn't really know how. Read, walk, sleep. But the silence wouldn't leave. It followed me like a shadow stretching longer by the hour. I started talking out loud, first to myself, then to the trees. I'd say things like, "You're okay. This is normal, you're healing," but I didn't believe any of it. Sometimes I'd lie in bed at night and hear the faint crack of branches outside and think someone was watching me. I even got up once and swept the perimeter with a flashlight, like I knew what I was doing. There was no one there, only the forest, watching, judging silent. The dreams were the worst. Flashbacks to the launch of our flagship app. Veritas champagne on the balcony, flashbulbs headlines that read, "Crypto's Truth Tellers." We were branded as ethical disruptors, proof that blockchain and transparency could coexist. But I knew the truth. We played that story like a bedtime tale. We gave the public a fairy tale so polished, so reassuring, they never bothered to ask what was real, and I stopped asking too. I woke up sweating one night, heart racing, convinced I'd heard a Slack notification. There was no phone. Just me. Just the echo of phantom noise and a voice in my head asking, "What were you really building?" Olivia. The next morning, I found it. An envelope. Plain white. No stamp. Just sitting at the edge of my doorstep, weighted by a pine cone. There was no address. No signature. Just a single sentence on a crisp sheet of paper. Who were you before people told you who to be? I froze. At first, I thought I was hallucinating. Maybe this was just my brain unraveling, but the paper was real. The ink smudged slightly when I touched it. I scanned the trees. Nothing moved. No footsteps, no tire tracks, just the stillness of snow and pine, and something I couldn't name pressing on my chest. Who had left it? A journalist. A stalker. One of my old co-founders trying to mess with me. I sat down on the porch steps, letter still in hand, and stared at the sky like it might answer. That question, it sliced through every layer I'd built around myself, before I was a crypto trader, before Veritas, before I became a brand. Who was I? I used to say I was just a girl from Minneapolis who taught herself Python at 14 and got lucky, but even that story was curated. Truth was, I didn't remember who I was before the noise, before I learned how to spin pain into PR, before I learned how to monetize my own ambition. The letter didn't scare me because someone had found me. It scared me because it knew me. And that night, for the first time, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I sat still, completely still, for hours, staring at that question like it was a mirror I'd been avoiding, and the silence didn't claw, it didn't scream, it whispered. It said, "There's more pain, more reckoning, more to face." I thought about burning the letter. I even held it over the fireplace once, but something made me fold it neatly and tuck it under the edge of the mattress. I wasn't ready to let it go. That night I wrote back, not because I knew who the sender was, but because I didn't. And maybe, just maybe, I wanted to answer that question. For myself, I wrote, before all of it, I was curious. I wanted to make something beautiful, something honest. But somewhere along the way, I started confusing noise with value, and when the applause came, I got addicted. It felt like writing to a ghost or a priest, or maybe just the version of me I used to be. I signed it with nothing, just left the page on the table and went to bed. The next morning, it was still there, untouched, unanswered. I told myself I was being paranoid that no one was out there, and that I was just unraveling and projecting and clinging to scraps of meaning because the silence had started to hollow me out. But somewhere deep down, I knew. This wasn't over. The detox had just begun. And solitude, this brutal, unrelenting solitude, wasn't done with me yet. Somewhere along the way, I stopped waiting for a reply. I kept writing, though. Each night, I'd sit at the old oak table, pen in hand, fireplace flickering, and write to whoever or whatever was sending those letters. Even when nothing came back, I wrote like it mattered, and maybe it did. Maybe I was writing to myself, or maybe to the version of me that still believed in things like authenticity. Not the kind we sold at conferences, the kind that bled through when no one was watching. The second letter came 6 days later. No pine cone this time, just folded neatly under the cabin's warped front door, like a ghost had slipped it through while I slept. When did you learn to lie so well you believed yourself? I read it 5 times before I moved. Then I sat on the porch steps and laughed. A dry, bitter laugh. The kind that doesn't come from amusement, but disbelief. Because deep down, I knew the answer. I was 27. We'd just landed our first million in seed money, and I had this sinking feeling that we'd promised more than we could deliver. But instead of admitting it, I smiled for the camera and said, "We're building a better future, one line of code at a time." That was the moment I learned that stories sell not truth, not data, just stories. I didn't lie to deceive, I lied to survive. But eventually, the stories I told others became the ones I told myself. That I was a visionary, that we were different, that we weren't just another tech company chasing valuation highs like addicts chasing their next hit. But we were, and so was I. So I wrote again, I learned to lie the day I realized the truth wasn't scalable. That line sat on the page like a confession. I didn't sign it. I didn't need to. The paper trembled as I folded it. This time I didn't tuck it under the mattress. I left it on the windowsill. Exposed. Vulnerable. Like I wanted the trees to judge me. The third letter came while it rained. A thick storm rolled in from the coast, turning the sky the color of ash. Thunder groaned like it had something to say. And in the middle of it all, there it was, another envelope, damp but intact. What part of you did you kill to become who they wanted? I didn't write back that night. I drank instead. Whiskey. I'd bought from a gas station on the drive up. I told myself I was just taking the edge off, but the truth was I didn't want to feel the answer. Not yet. The next morning I stumbled into the bathroom. Hair a mess. Face swollen. And I looked into the mirror for the first time in weeks. At first, I didn't recognize her. The eyes were mine, sure, but tired. Dull skin pale, like the life had drained from it. I stared and stared until the air felt thick and my knees buckled. I sank to the floor, arms wrapped around myself like I could keep the pieces from falling apart. And that's when it broke. Everything, I screamed. Not like in movies, not poetic. Not beautiful, ugly, guttural, a sound that scraped from my lungs like it had been hiding there for years. A sound no one else heard, but I swear it echoed. I kicked over the trash bin, threw the whiskey bottle against the tub, ripped my journal in half, tore the letters, slammed the mirror with the heel of my palm until it cracked, and then I collapsed again, sobbing, shaking cold. It was the kind of breakdown they warn you about in detox centers, the kind that feels like dying even though you know you're still breathing. I don't know how long I lay there. Could have been 10 minutes. Could have been an hour. The storm outside was the only clock I had. Eventually, I crawled out, sat in front of the fire, wrapped in a blanket like a child who'd seen a monster and didn't know if it was real. I burned the journal, watched each page curl, blacken, and disappear into smoke. The ink danced in the flames like the lies were finally being released. And then in the quiet, something shifted. Not peace, but something close to relief. I wasn't pretending anymore. I wasn't curating my emotions. I wasn't writing for likes or attention or legacy. I had cracked, completely. And maybe that's what I needed, because buried beneath all that rage and shame and sorrow, there was still something left. Fragile, yes, but still mine. I went back to the mirror later that night. The crack was still there, running diagonally like a scar. But when I looked this time, I saw something different. A woman who had broken but not vanished. A woman who wasn't finished. And maybe a woman who was finally ready to tell herself the truth. Not the story, not the brand, the truth. It's strange what happens after you break. Not all at once, but completely, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. I didn't bounce back. There was no montage of healing, just quiet mornings that didn't hurt quite as much as the ones before I started walking. At first, I stayed close to the cabin, circling like a scared animal that wasn't sure if the world was still dangerous. But slowly, the forest became less threatening. I started walking deeper, letting the path choose me. The silence didn't chase me anymore. It walked beside me. I'd pause sometimes just to listen, not for threats, but for nothing. And in that nothing, I began to hear something I hadn't heard in a long time. Myself. Not the voice I used for interviews, not the strategic version of me that made investors nod. The voice that had been buried under layers of pressure performance and pretending. It whispered things like, "You don't have to know yet," or "You're allowed to rest." And the most radical one of all, "You're still here." I stopped writing letters, not out of defiance, just because the conversation had moved inward. Then one afternoon, while cleaning out an old canvas duffel bag I hadn't touched since arriving, I found a flash drive, dusty bent slightly at the corner. I didn't remember packing it. Curiosity won. I booted up the old offline laptop I'd been journaling on, plugged it in, waited. What popped up made my stomach flip. Project Echo. Deep empathy. Conversational heuristic operator. My code. My old code. I'd built it 5 years ago as a side project, an AI designed to simulate empathetic dialogue for mental wellness apps. It used machine learning to mirror emotional tones and deliver questions designed to spark deep reflection. I never launched it. Too risky, too real, too untested. But I'd trained it on my own journal entries, my private thoughts, my fears, my ambitions, and I'd forgotten it existed. Until now. The letters, every single one. It had been me. My code. My ghost. My mirror. I sat back in the chair and let out a sound I hadn't made in weeks. Laughter. Not the bitter kind from the porch, not the empty kind I used in meetings. Real laughter, loud and stupid and full of disbelief. I laughed until tears rolled down my cheeks, because of course it was me, because only I could know exactly where to stab. Only I could ask the questions I'd spent my entire career avoiding, and somehow that made it better. There was no stranger out there, no stalker, no ex-partner trying to haunt me. It was just me, finally talking to myself. I spent the next few days rereading those old journal entries, raw, messy, full of fire. I barely recognized the woman who wrote them. But then I found one, a page torn at the edge, scribbled at 2:11 a.m., dated 7 years ago. I don't want to build tech. I want to build truth. That line hit me like a punch in the chest. I closed the laptop and stared into the fire. All this time I thought I'd lost myself in the noise, but maybe I just stopped listening. Maybe the horror stories we tell ourselves that we're failures, frauds, broken beyond repair aren't really horror stories at all. Maybe they're warning signs, road flares, grief trying to shape itself into something we can survive. Mental resilience doesn't always look like progress. Sometimes it looks like falling apart, then waking up to find you still exist. I began creating rituals, not because they were productive, but because they were sacred. I made tea every morning and watched the steam rise. I lit a candle at sunset and sat with the flames until they flickered out. I went on walks without headphones. I stopped narrating my life like it was content. I let it just be. Life. And the strangest thing happened. Ideas came back. Not the flashy startup kind, not pitches or decks or user flow diagrams. Real ideas, honest thoughts about purpose, about quiet, about why we chase validation until we lose ourselves in the chase. There was a stillness in me now that didn't exist before, not because the silence had changed, but because I had. And in that stillness, I started to dream again, not of empires or apps or Forbes lists, but of impact, of truth, of writing something that didn't have a strategy behind it, just heart. I didn't know what was next. But for the first time, I was okay with not knowing. I went to the river one evening where I had thrown my phone. Weeks earlier, I stood at the edge and closed my eyes. I said thank you, not to anyone, not even to myself, just to the silence, because in all its brutality, it had given me back the one thing I didn't even know I'd lost, the ability to be still, and hear the sound of my own life unfiltered. I never planned to go back, not to the company, not to the noise, not even to the person I used to be. But the truth is, I didn't need to go back. Because something had shifted. I didn't crave headlines anymore. I didn't dream about panels or podcasts or the kind of influence that used to light up my ego like a Christmas tree. What I wanted was to speak without shouting. So I opened an anonymous Substack. No bio, no name, no history. Just words. Raw, imperfect, true. I titled it The Paradox of Solitude. It wasn't strategy. It was surrender. The first post was simple. A few paragraphs on what it means to sit with silence instead of escaping it. I thought maybe 5 people would read it, maybe none. But something strange happened. Someone screenshotted it, posted it to a thread titled Reddit Stories that hit too close to home. It got shared, then reshared, then it grew. Not viral in the flashy sense, not trending or algorithmic, just slow organic, like a whispered secret passed from one soul to another, and people started writing back. Not just comments, but letters, messages, stories. They didn't know who I was, but they knew what I meant. They wrote about silence after divorce, after layoffs, after funerals, about the empty space that follows the collapse of a life you once thought was solid. They wrote about rebuilding from inside. And suddenly I didn't feel alone anymore, not because I had an audience, but because I was in communion with people who were also learning how to be with themselves. A few months later, I got an email. A professor from MIT. He'd read the Substack and wanted me to speak at a seminar on ethical AI design. Said my insights were radical but necessary. I thanked him, then said no. Not out of spite, not from fear, just clarity. I didn't want the stage anymore. I wanted the stillness. So I stayed, kept writing, kept walking, kept sipping tea as the seasons shifted around me. There's a rhythm to solitude once you stop resisting it. It doesn't rush, doesn't demand. It just invites you back to yourself over and over until the invitation becomes a homecoming. One morning I woke up early, before the sun, frost still clinging to the windows like breath. I pulled out a fresh piece of paper and wrote a single sentence. Who were you before people told you who to be? Folded it, slipped it into a plain envelope, took a pine cone from the yard, and drove into town for the first time in months. There was a bookstore downtown with a bulletin board out front, flyers for guitar lessons, dog walkers, lost cats. I tucked the envelope behind a poster that read, "Looking for something more." Then I left. No one saw me. No one needed to, because the paradox of solitude isn't that it disconnects you, it's that it prepares you to connect, not from need, but from overflow, from knowing that you don't need applause to be enough, from realizing that authenticity isn't something you build, it's something you return to. That night I lit a candle, not for ceremony, just because it was quiet and beautiful and alive in its stillness. I sat beside it, hands in my lap, heart strangely full. I thought about how all my life I'd chased meaning in the external, the next milestone, the next pitch, the next product. But none of that had given me what this silence had, the unshakable, irreversible knowing that I was okay, not perfect, not finished, but whole. I smiled, not because of success, but because I had nothing to prove. And that smile was mine.